Hello, welcome back. I'm glad you're here. We have a lot to talk about. If you're watching this video, it probably means you just watched the Kraken versus HiJinx fight. That would be Season 6, Episode 6. If you haven't seen that yet, turn this off. Go catch up. It's on Discovery, Discovery Plus, and Amazon. It's fine. I'll be here. You can come back later. Yar, there'll be spoilers ahead. Okay. If you're still watching this, I'm going to assume that you're into this, so here we go. Okay, so first off, if Kraken is fighting any robot other than HiJinx, I will be cheering for Kraken, but that is not the way things played out, so here we go. And I'll tell you why. One, Kraken is a crusher in a field of high kinetic energy robots, so that's playing the BattleBots game on hard mode, and two, Kraken is effective at what it does. You can put Kraken in the arena with any top 16 robot and just watch your whole bracket get upset. Three, I love Matt Spurk and family, Sarah Spurk. When I look across the pit and I see that Kraken's in the house, I know I'm going to have a great day because they're a part of it. Okay, that's enough. I will stop being a stan for Kraken and will actually do my job. Okay. All right. It's good. I need a booster seat. In the last video, we talked about rotational kinetic energy, gear ratios, hardware selection. Today we're going to talk about the coefficient of friction and radio control because those were two things that mattered a lot in this fight. Before I sat down to make this video, I actually watched an unedited recording of HiJinx versus Kraken because during the fight I'm all like adrenaline and red mist. And I have to say, on review, that was not the overwhelming absolute victory that I would prefer to see from this robot. I think there were several places where the tide really could have turned against us. And we did get a unanimous judges decision, but that unanimous decision was like 6-5, 6-5, 6-5, not 11-0, 11-0. So yeah, that prompted some changes that we made immediately in the pits, and also some changes we're now making in the in-between season to get ready for Season 7. So let's start with friction. And I'm going to throw out three terms here: friction, friction force, and coefficient of friction. So what is friction? Friction is the force resisting the relative motion of solid surfaces, fluid layers, other things that want to slide against each other. There are several types of friction, but when it comes to driving upside down, we are primarily concerned with drive friction, the force that opposes the relative lateral movement of two solid surfaces in contact. In this case, the solid surfaces would be our head and the floor. Friction force is the force exerted by a surface as an object moves across it or tries to move across it. And the coefficient of friction is the ratio between the force necessary to move one surface horizontally over the other and the pressure between those two surfaces. This is represented in equations by the Greek letter mu. Mu. If you think about a cat, it might help you remember cat posting. Hashtag MadCatter. A low value of the coefficient of friction indicates that the force required for sliding is lower, and when the surface changes and that number goes up, the force required to make them slide is higher. So low coefficient of friction moves with less force. High coefficient of friction means you need more force to move the object. So mathematically, mu equals F divided by N, where F is frictional force and N is normal force. Now we're talking physics, and physics is fun. So HiJinx is designed to drive upside down and to use the tail to self-right against the wall or an arena feature. I've had some fans ask why we don't use a disc or a tri-bar like other horizontal spinners do, and the short answer is if we used either of those two weapon designs, we simply would not be able to self-right the way we want to. In order for us to self-right using the tail, the weapon has to be off, we move over to the wall or something, and generally the weapon bar will sort of move out of the way because there's very little friction on the weapon stack when it's correctly aligned. If we had a disc installed, the shape of the disc would literally be in the way. We wouldn't be able to flip ourselves over, which most of the time is what we want to do. We want to have our wheels on the ground. And it turns out a lot of competitors would like to see us on our heads. And I can't blame them. I love helicopters too. Side note, early in my pilot training, I did 2 days of helicopter training, and I decided that maybe flying helicopters was not for me. Like, maybe I have enough high-stress hobbies right now? Hashtag Top Gun memes. When fighting almost anyone in the current field of robots, it is better for HiJinx to be right side up. That puts the weapon low. It gives us a better chance at taking body shots on the opponent, as well as hitting their weapon or hitting their wheels. But we can't always turn off the weapon and just mosey over to the wall, so we need to be able to drive inverted. So contact patches matter. The contact patch is the part of HiJinx that is in contact with the floor. Same way when you're racing or just driving a car, your contact patches are actually about an inch per tire. That's all you get between your car and the road. When we're right side up, the contact patches on HiJinx, the part of HiJinx that's making contact with the floor, is basically a small square on each of the two wheels and then the tail. When we're upside down, the contact patches are still the wheels, but also the head. The center of gravity for HiJinx is just behind the center of the weapon stack. It's a pretty well-balanced bird. By necessity, the contact patch on the head is wider than on the tail, so more surface on the head is making contact with the floor. And it's a painted surface, whereas the tails are ground and polished to a nice smooth finish, a little wedge, a little sneaky wedge. The floor of the BattleBots does change between seasons, but it's always steel, and it's always painted. In years past, the paint was similar to the sticky black paint that's used on aircraft carrier decks, and that makes sense because if you're on an aircraft carrier deck, you don't want to fall off. And generally speaking, grip on the floor is a good thing, actually. In 2021, I believe the paint was changed to something less sticky, but it's still a textured surface. The coefficient of friction for steel on steel is about 0.6 to 0.7, but the paints on the robot and the floor really change that number in ways I can't really test for. Hello, Trey. Hi, it's Jen from HiJinx. Yeah, I was wondering if I could have a piece of the arena for testing in the off-season. Oh, it's in storage? Where is it being stored? Maybe next year. So, after the fight with Mammoth, we did a whole robot teardown, which is normal. A little sip of coffee. Gotta stay hydrated. And I had a look at where the paint had been scraped off of the head when we had been running upside down, which is a good clue for where we're gonna have the most friction when we're running inverted. And since I can't do tests on the floor, the next best thing is to change the material on that area of the head. So while the coefficient of friction of the paint is unknown, I do know of a material that's guaranteed to have a lower coefficient of friction than either paint or polished steel, and that's UHMW. UHMW is ultra-high molecular weight polyethylene. This is an extremely tough plastic with high abrasion and wear resistance. It's what we use for the wheels, and it's what Shatter uses for a blade of armor. Generally speaking, UHMW has a coefficient of friction of 0.14 or lower, so compared to steel on steel at 0.6, we're already improving. There are many flavors of UHMW available, and the material scientists who create it cater each formula to specific purposes. And the purpose that I have in mind is slipping, so I bought slippery UHMW. Initially, I had it in mind to put a 1/8 inch thick strip of slippery UHMW on the head of HiJinx just where the paint had been scraped off, so I polished that area of the steel, took all the paint off, made it nice and shiny and slippery, and then I used the hardware locations that hold the head onto the rest of the chassis to go through the UHMW to try to keep it in place. The hardware solution was only okay. The force of HiJinx pushing on the UHMW eventually tore it away and exposed the polished steel underneath, which is still better than paint on mystery material on the floor. But then Orion had an improved idea, a whole block of UHMW to mount on the tail, not the head, but it would stand up taller than the head and be able to take a lot of abuse. When we got the material in the pits, oh my gosh, I do not enjoy cutting UHMW. It resists being cut. That's its job, right? But we have a bandsaw and determination. So Madeline and I took turns cutting and shaping blocks, drilling hardware locations, countersinking them so that the hardware was sitting lower than the UHMW, and then matching all those hardware locations to the tail. Also, thank you Autodesk for bringing so many large tools for us to play with. Sincerely appreciate that. Later fights, you're gonna see this black block on the butt of HiJinx, and then you'll know exactly what that is. So you might be wondering then, if friction between the robot head and the floor is a known problem, why paint the robot at all? Well, for the glamour shots, duh! I mean, Chris Rose said it best. HiJinx is the most beautiful robot in the competition. Sorry, HyperShock. Oh, and I do mean sorry, HyperShock. I love HyperShock. Also, thank you to our new sponsor, Montana Cans, for making the brightest paint possible. And then onto the radio. Okay, just between us, the first two fights of Season 6 gave me just about the most anxiety I have ever experienced in combat robotics. Not only because we had made an entirely new HiJinx and we had upgraded every system, but because we had new problems I'd never experienced before. In particular, radio signal interference and static shocks. What isn't shown before the fight with Mammoth was that we lost a drive speed controller in the battery tent, powering the robot on. This is a problem that every team was struggling to handle. The components on our motor controllers are not tolerant to high volt shocks. The voltage limit for our drive speed controllers is 75 volts. When you feel a static shock, you are experiencing a minimum of 3,000 volts of electricity. Very low amp, very high volt. The shock is known as electrostatic discharge, or ESD, and it wreaks havoc on electronics. And after we had fixed that and loaded HiJinx into the arena for power on, we couldn't control the robot. Terror. Gut-churning terror. When that happened, Orion went over to the door to power cycle HiJinx, basically turn it off and on again, which is frequently the right thing to do when something is misbehaving. And then suddenly we had some control. Great! Then Orion walked over to the driver's area and we couldn't control the robot. And then he walked back to the door and we got control again. So what's up with that? One thing I noticed in the red square driver area was a new black box on the floor on the left side with some thick cables running in and out. If I had $1, I would bet that that was probably a high voltage junction, maybe running power to lights or sound equipment, and it was either unshielded or inadequately shielded, and the electrical field from that was causing noise, basically interfering with the communication between our controller and the receiver inside of HiJinx. This is why for several fights you'll see Orion standing at the door asking the cameraman for elbow room instead of being in the driver's area. It was a short-term workaround, but if it works, it works. In seasons past, I've never had this problem before, our team hasn't had this problem, but other teams have. And if you think having a bolt back out is an embarrassing way to lose a fight, imagine just watching your robot derp around the arena for a minute uncontrolled. I have anxiety. In the postseason, I did a very non-scientific survey with the other teams to see who had controller issues and what combinations of controllers and receivers they were using. We had been running the Tyrannus X-Lite controller with the FR Sky X8R receiver, and it turns out a few other teams that were running similar combinations had similar issues. But before we blame hardware, we have to acknowledge that when it comes to signal, there are so many things that can go wrong. Where do I even start? Oh, how about the location of the antenna inside your robot, interference from your own electrical components, the material properties of your armor, whether that's steel or plastic or OMG carbon fiber like some teams have tried to use, which will just absorb signal, by the way. How about ground loops in your wiring, or things that are touching the chassis where they shouldn't, metal on metal contact. Oh, and then there's signal strength and range, which can be affected by everything from the charge on your batteries to physical objects in between you and your robot, and more. Oh, and then there's frequency. Do you run at 2.4 gigahertz like most of the field is doing for good omnidirectional control? But it's also a very crowded signal right now because everyone is using it. Do you run 900 megahertz because you want a longer range? 900 megahertz is rumored to have more glitching when metal touches metal, you know, like what happens during a fight. Or do you get a fancy controller with a backup frequency? Like, there's a lot of choices you can make here. And if this is something that you are interested in for drones or combat robots or just art projects, there's a wealth of information online for you to check out, like way more than I could possibly cover in one post-fight video. What I do want to talk about for us is our plan for Season 7 and maybe show you some of the controllers that I have lying around, just, you know, for the funness. As a result of this persistent interference, we're probably changing out our controllers and receivers for Season 7. We're just looking for probably the most robust system that we can get our little paws on. Oh, first off, this is this is a pistol grip. This is a cheapy peepee. This came with an RC truck that I hacked up to make a tiny robot out of, but honestly, I quite like this style. I think HyperShock runs a nicer, more expensive version of this. For driving RC cars and trucks, I think this is very intuitive for steering. Just a little throttle on the trigger, steering up here. Diana Tarleson on Scorpios also uses like a much nicer version of this controller to control the weapon on Scorpio, since she famously accidentally ripped the wheel off a couple of times. She goes She-Hulk. This guy is probably the cheapest that I have in my whole collection. It actually came with a small drone, and I got the drone mostly to annoy a friend of mine. Long story. This style of controller you'll see all over the tiny robot world. I got this one for my Antweight. It's reasonably inexpensive, plastic body, It works okay, but it's kind of chunky. The reason why you'll see a lot of robo-tiers with the lanyard on is because they're actually very easy to drop, so having something that tethers you to it is good. It prevents you from dropping it on the floor. Oh, let me show you one more. Oh, this is a fancy boy. This is the duplex computer radio control system. It's pretty similar to what I use at work in subscale flight. It has a lot of bells and whistles. Every switch is programmable, so we can play around with where the controls should be, like where does it feel good or intuitive to control certain aspects of a large drone or a large robot, especially when you have multiple systems interacting. And it does have 2.4 gigahertz and 900 megahertz as backup. That's a safety feature to prevent a crash or flyaway event. This is one of the best controllers that I've used, and it's just wonderful. But Jesus, that price! Well, if you'd like to sponsor HiJinx for Season 7, drop a link in the comments, because I would like to talk to you. Oh, and this is what we are currently using on HiJinx. This is the FR Sky Tyrannus X-Lite. Orion and I both have one. His is red and mine is black. That is on purpose, so that we don't mix them up. Could you imagine if we loaded HiJinx into the arena and Orion goes to pick up the controller and he picks up the wrong controller and it just doesn't work? Actually, I can easily imagine that. That's why we color code them. We both like these. For me, especially, it fits really well in my little girl hands, and it feels like a game controller. Like when I hold this, I feel like I'm sitting down to play Smash Brothers with my friends. So I really like everything about this, but the big problem is the batteries. They only come in one size, and that it's kind of a design limitation. So what I think we might like to do immediately to boost signal is, instead of running at a few hundred milliwatts, we just run up to like a 1 watt output, more power, more signal strength. So what we might wind up doing is switching out to a different FR Sky Tyrannus model, like one of the older ones that has the modular battery pack on the back, so we can put more power on it. The Tyrannus overall, like, it's okay. It's better in form factor than some of the older controllers, so it should be okay for either of us to handle. And more power is better, better antenna is better, more nimble protocol is better. And when I say better for either of us to handle, that's because of another change that we're making for Season 7. So far, Orion has been driving HiJinx and controlling weapon at the same time. In the past, when we've built big spinners on different teams, we both sort of concluded that the gyroscopic force of the weapon has such an impact on driving that the driver should control both. But what we found on HiJinx being a wide boy, HiJinx is stable enough that we could probably separate the weapon away from the drive and have one person just focused on drive and another person focused on the throttle for the weapon control. And that means for the first time ever on this robot, we're going to split the weapon and the drive onto 2 controllers. This is going to be fun for me, and we need to practice. At my day job, I run a ground control station for small experimental aircraft, and I'm kind of used to being the one telling the pilot what to do based on what I see on my screen, on the telemetry that we're getting back on the aircraft. When Orion is driving, I'm going to have to listen to him and respond. It's going to be great. We're going to have a whole Pacific Rim syncing moment. It's going to be megabots all over again. Some fans have asked why Orion is driving the robot, and the truth is, of everyone on the team, he has the most experience driving large combat robots, and he's very good at it. Kenny Florian called him a legendary, and we'll take that. And, I'm a good driver, but Orion does have more experience in that area. But also, our driving styles are pretty different. Orion is a very cool-headed, very in-control driver. He is the Iceman to my Maverick. Also, he got me this for Christmas. And to answer your next question, no, we're not dating, ladies. It's gonna be fun. I'm looking forward to this a lot. I'm looking forward to everything that we're going to implement in Season 7. I'm also looking forward to having my hands back on the controls again. I think it's going to be really fun. Yeah, it's going to be good. On that note, to everyone who joined us on the Reddit AMA, thank you very much. I really appreciate your questions. It is a genuine treat for us to be able to interact with fans, and I hope you'll stay tuned for the rest of Season 6 and come back for Season 7 too.